Thanks, Cole. Okay, so this morning the Transition Committee met, and as I was leaving the State Admin Centre, I indicated that whilst we'd had substantial discussions in relation to the issues around New South Wales and ACT border restrictions, I wasn't in a position to make a final decision, and I was awaiting further advice. As it turns out, that advice was much more speedy than I anticipated, and it was only after a short time, having returned to the office, that I'd received the advice I was waiting for. As a result of that advice, I'm able to advise that effective midnight tonight, the requirement to quarantine for 14 days will be lifted for people travelling between ACT and South Australia. New South Wales, the 14-day quarantine period will remain in force for the foreseeable future until such time as South Australian health experts are satisfied that the community transmission issues which are occurring in New South Wales have abated to the degree that we can allow that movement from New South Wales into South Australia without adversely impacting on the risk to the South Australian community from a public health point of view. So as of midnight tonight, people wishing to travel between the ACT and South Australia will be able to do so without having to quarantine when arriving in South Australia. They will be required to still fill in the pre-approval online, as with all other safe community transmission zones, and people will be required to declare that they have not been outside of a safe community transmission zone for the 14-day period prior to travelling into South Australia. This is our way of assuring as best as possible that those people travelling between South Australia and other places have not exposed themselves unnecessarily to the risk of contracting COVID-19 and therefore bringing it into South Australia.
So, Commissioner, does that mean from air and or road?
You can only come in from ACT by air because to come by road you would have to travel through New South Wales, and then the 14-day quarantine period would apply.
So if someone, for instance, had left the ACT and could somehow prove they hadn't left their car, for instance? No, it's simply not possible for us to be confident that a person driving between ACT and South Australia has not had contact with members of the New South Wales community. We're hopeful that the situation with New South Wales will continue to improve. My advice from Health is that they are doing an exceptional job with contact tracing, and they are confident that the situation will improve there to the point where we can lift that 14-day quarantine. But for this current time being, people travelling from ACT must travel directly from the ACT to South Australia.
What was the advice that you were waiting on?
I was waiting on further advice from the Chief Executive of Health, which I won't specify the detail of, and also Crown advice in relation to some elements regarding constitutional framework, making sure that what we're doing in South Australia was appropriate and enabling movement between the jurisdictions as much as possible, and balancing that with public health advice as well. No legal issues. I wanted to ensure that we were accommodating the public health dimensions with the constitutional framework and the ability for people to travel between jurisdictions as freely as possible for economic and social reasons. And I was provided that advice by the Crown Solicitor just after coming back to the office.
Are we looking at days now from New South Wales weeks? Is it really this open-ended time frame still?
It is an open-ended time frame because New South Wales is continuing to identify isolated cases of community transmission. And the advice from the Chief Public Health Officer is that we want to see a better situation in terms of community transmission before we relax the restrictions on New South Wales. So it's not possible to put a time frame on it, but the indicators are that New South Wales is heading in the right direction and are doing a very good job of contact tracing.
Oh, it's just that point. So that was one of the key points of discussion with Professor Screw this morning, was her reservations about the situation in New South Wales. So she's still paying.
That's correct. New South Wales. The reality is that ACT has done exceptionally well in managing COVID-19, but it is, for all intents and purposes, geographically aligned to New South Wales. So the level of comfort we have with ACT doesn't, at this point in time, translate to New South Wales. We're hopeful that that will change soon, but at this point in time, it is simply a decision for the ACT.
How difficult is it going to be police having people coming from ACT and making sure that they haven't been in New South Wales?
We currently allow people to transit from safe transmission zones such as Queensland through ACT to South Australia, as well as Tasmania, ACT and South Australia. We are requiring people to make a declaration on their pre-approval, and we expect people to be honest in that declaration. If we have information or evidence that suggests people have not been truthful, then we'll deal with that as we identify those people.
Commissioner, can you, I know you said you can't go into the advice that you received or wanted from Dr. McGowan. Can you elaborate what other advice was needed before you made this decision, given the fact that you were in a meeting with him for a couple of hours this morning?
Dr. McGowan wanted to go back and provide me some written advice, and that was what I was waiting for, but I don't see it necessary to elaborate on all aspects of the advice that I took on board as a result of the transition committee process and other factors that I had to take into account. This is my decision, and the transition committee exists to provide me a balanced view on different perspectives relating to public health, the economic impacts of the restrictions we have in place, as well as the social impacts, and all of those things have been taken into account.
This morning you said...
There's a lot of complexity that go into the background of all these decisions, and I'm not in a position where I'm prepared to elaborate at this point in time.
Commissioner, this morning
was it mainly the health situation, the ACT? What was, I guess, the deciding factor?
The prevailing advice that I rely on most substantially is public health advice. Professor Spurrier has done an exceptional job so far in providing a balanced perspective in relation to the imperatives in relation to protecting the public health of South Australia, and acknowledging that these measures that we put in place to achieve that do come with some consequences. So it is about finding that balance, and it was a very constructive conversation in Transition Committee this morning that looked at all of those aspects.
Commissioner, this morning you said outside state admin after the meeting that you would make a decision this week, either for or against, which my recollection is included New South Wales. Is that still, given this advice you received, that New South Wales a open or stay shut decision will be made this week?
I wouldn't foreshadow any further decisions in relation to relaxation of border restrictions at this point. ACT has been dealt with separately to New South Wales. We'll continue to monitor the performance of New South Wales as it relates to community transmission and identifying the sources of those community transmissions. Ideally, we'll be looking for a 14-day period with no community transmission in New South Wales, which will give us the comfort to make a move to remove that 14-day quarantine.
Okay, so that the 14 days, and I haven't seen today, is yesterday was a community transmission, so that would be at least another fortnight.
Not necessarily. The issue with community transmission, as I'm advised by Health, is that we have to identify the source of that community transmission, and once the source is identified, that essentially means that they can disregard that one from the 14-day count perspective. So we're advised daily by Health in terms of where we currently sit.
Can I come from another direction? What would be the earliest, given your current advice at this minute, New South Wales would open? What would be the earliest on that basis?
My understanding is the most recent community transmission case that would be of concern would probably be in about 2 or 3 days ago. So we're looking, 10 or 11 days if everything went well from here.
What about Broken Hill? Is there any leniency there? Did you see border restrictions lifted for that particular town?
We treat all states and territories in Australia as separate jurisdictions. Broken Hill sits within that its own jurisdiction, but we do have considerable leniency with the exemptions for people who reside in Broken Hill because of their close relationship with South Australia, and there are not too many people in Broken Hill who are disadvantaged by the fact that they're simply located in a different state to South Australia.
Commissioner, can you elaborate on what's changed in terms of separating the ACT and New South Wales? For so long we've been told that they've been treated as one and the same issue. Now suddenly ACT is now separate and you're now not as optimistic about lifting New South Wales borders in the foreseeable future, certainly in the coming days. What's changed?
Well, let me say I am optimistic about New South Wales. The advice that I've been provided certainly suggests that they're on the right pathway to eliminating community transmission sooner than later. There has been no change in the performance of managing COVID-19 from an ACT point of view, and I think we're up to about 66 days with no active cases. The fact that New South Wales is travelling well, the continued good performance of ACT and the mitigation that's being put in place in terms of people having not left the ACT when travelling to South Australia has enabled the Transition Committee to formulate a position that we can make this move. It should be stated that if there are any fresh concerns as a result of COVID-19 activity in ACT or a substantial increase of COVID-19 in New South Wales, then we would revisit the decision in relation to the 14-day quarantine for the ACT. This is not a permanent revocation of the 14-day quarantine. This is where we're able to be at the moment, and we're providing the opportunity for people to undertake business and social and family activities as they need to with the ACT. But people should understand that this is a pandemic. We don't control it. We are simply responding to it as best as we can.
Have there been any other decisions made or any other debate occurred in Transition Committee today about other lifting of other restrictions throughout South Australia?
No, the predominant conversation today was in relation to New South Wales ACT.
What would be your message to people in New South Wales who are considering driving to the ACT and just outside to Adelaide?
That would not be consistent with the process we've put in place. If we identify that that's occurred, then we would certainly be looking to take action for the breach.
What would that action involve?
Expiation of $1,060, or we could initiate a criminal prosecution and put a person before a South Australian court. As I've said, people will be required to fill in the pre-approval form. The ACT essentially is no different now to Queensland, Northern Territory, Western Australia or Tasmania. People do the pre-approval. They must declare that they have not been outside of a safe transmission zone, and we will speak to them as they arrive in South Australia. We will put them through our process. Sure.